in the Department of Anthropology, and I'm the lab's coordinator. Before we begin, I'll give a brief visual description of myself and offer a land acknowledgement. I'm a white guy with long curly-ish brown hair and a short beard. I'm wearing a navy blue hoodie. Behind me is a small dresser and a shelf with some books and plants, and a blue painting and one of those papery IKEA lamps, and my gray walls. My pronouns are he, him, more or less. I'd like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. So today's event is scheduled to run for 2 hours. It is being recorded, and I will enable the closed captioning. Before I hand things off to Andrew Gilbert, who will tell you a bit more about our Meet the Lab series, I'd like to plug an upcoming methods workshop we're hosting titled Ethnography in and of the Archive, featuring Natalie Rothman. That'll take place next Tuesday. I'll put a link to that event in the chat, and I'm also going to put a link to the Ethnography Lab website where you can find more information about our upcoming events. And you can also find us on social media. If you'd like to get on our mailing list, please send me a direct message in the chat and I'll make sure to add you. So with that, I'll hand things over to Andrew, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah, I'll add, it's delightful to see so many people here for this event. I'm briefly just gonna give some background for those who don't know about it, that this is part of a larger series of events that we call Meet the Labs, in which kind of we're hosting kind of representatives of multiple ethnography labs, in this case mobility labs, to kind of come together to learn and be inspired by what it is that that they're doing. If there's one thing that the pandemic, one positive side of the pandemic has made possible, these kinds of gatherings and kind of mutually learning spaces. And so we're capitalizing on that and continue to do so. We had our first event about 1.5 years ago at one of the American Anthropological Association virtual events that gathered people from the Ethnography Lab in Irvine, Montreal, at Concordia, University of Toronto, and the Experimental Ethnography Lab in Pennsylvania. And then the next one was from the Kaleidos Ethnography Lab in Ecuador, together with representatives of the Stadtlabor for Multimodal Anthropology in Berlin. And then most recently, back in the fall, early winter of last year, we had our most recent, until now, event with representatives of the Making Cultures Lab at Simon Fraser University, and then Elizabeth Chin's initiative out of the College of Design down in Los Angeles. So this is an ongoing space, and for these kinds of interesting, you know, I always come away from these events really inspired, and I'm looking forward to having this be the same. This one was organized by our own William Stafford, who I'm going to hand it off to now. Again, welcome everyone, and William, take it away.
So hello everyone, thank you Andrew for that. So my name is William, my pronouns are he and him, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow in visual studies at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and a research affiliate with the lab. And I work on public mobility and panic buttons in Delhi. So I'll be the moderator today, and I'm very glad to see there's so much interest in the themes and the speakers, and I welcome all of you. So the theme for today is mobility, and our panelists have generously agreed to share their thoughts and the work of their respective organizations on methods for studying it, and the various methodological, conceptual, and institutional questions such research entails. They represent an exciting range of work, and I'll briefly introduce them here before we begin. Tarini Bedi is director of the Mobilities Methods Lab at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and associate professor in the Department of Anthropology. Her recently published book, Mumbai Taxi Men, takes up the taxi as a material object, economic and political connection, expression of kinship, and embodiment of time, developing a novel topological approach to the spatiality of what those who labor with taxis might call motoring. Melissa Cefkin is a corporate and design research anthropologist, currently senior staff researcher at the autonomous driving technology company Waymo, based in California, with extensive experience researching social environments of automobility, technology use and adoption, and work practice analysis. Across the various roles she has taken up, the long arc of her work stands as an important engagement with the use of ethnography to inflect and inform industrial and corporate practices and imaginations of social interactions. Xiang Biao is director of the recently established Department for the Anthropology of Economic Experimentation at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, based in Halle, Germany, which is the home of the Mobility, Technology, and Wellbeing Lab, or MOLAB. His 2008 book, Global Body Shopping, was awarded the Anthony Leeds Prize, and his contemporary work represents a broad-ranging intervention in the conceptualization of mobility, as infrastructure, as governance, as economic mediation, and more. So before I hand it over to our speakers, I would first like to share some information on how we'll proceed. So each of the presenters will speak for about 20 minutes. Once they've all had an opportunity to share and pose some questions to each other, we'll open the discussion to everyone. So we would ask that if you have a question, you can either enter it in the chat or use the raise hand function, and we'll probably take up the questions in batches, seeing how many people there are, and what we assume will be a lot of questions and an interesting discussion. And we would just remind you to mute your mic while the panelists are speaking. And the order of the speakers will be Tarini, Bedi, Melissa Cefkin, and Xiang. With that said, I hope you'll all join me in welcoming them. And if Tarini, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you so much, William, and to the Ethnography Lab for inviting me to participate. I'm rather humbled by the fact that I'm, even part of these conversations, because our Mobilities and Methods Lab is sort of has been through various stages, and I would say continues to still be in incipient stages, even though it's been around for a couple of years. But I would love to hear and learn from others who are doing this kind of work. So I am, my name is Tarini Bedi, and I'm a sociocultural anthropologist. And I came to questions of mobilities really through my interlocutors in many ways, because I work a lot with moving people, with people who move around for political reasons and for reasons of livelihood. So I actually just on this lab, the Mobilities and Methods Lab really came about as a dissemination project, rather than necessarily a research project, even though it grew out of research that I myself do. And I want to give a big shout out, by the way, to labs never come together alone. And so this began as sort of a dissemination project when we were all immobilized. I was funded for my own research by the US National Science Foundation. And the National Science Foundation program in the United States has actually a very marvelous piece, which is where you fund your own research, but they're really committed to what are called broader impacts. And I thought quite carefully about what broader impacts meant for my own project. I've been working for several years in the city of Mumbai, but also in other parts of Asia. I've been doing quite a bit of work in Singapore. I work at the moment on 4 different projects, and my vision was to see mobilities not simply in terms of transportation, even though I work a lot on transportation, but I started to think of mobilities in these various ways, because I'm actually now working on a project that deals with pilgrimage mobilities across borders between India and Pakistan. So we think in the Mobilities Lab, we actually think of mobilities in very broad ways. So it's transportation, it's infrastructure, it's, as William said, it's sort of, it's a form of sociality, it's a form of topology, it's a form of various different kinds of things. And so I was unable to actually do any of the actual research that I work on in the pandemic. So I decided to actually focus largely on the dissemination piece, which began in 2020. And I also saw this as a pedagogical project to work with graduate students in my own department. So, I think what's interesting about these labs, from everything I've heard and seen, is that, all of us are working at these different scales, and my lab largely emerged as a departmental lab in my anthropology department. And I started to work with some of my graduate students, and some of whom are hopefully here today. There's Kim Garza, Doyen Shin, Lakshita Malik, Josephine Chet, and more recently, Dhwanit Sharma, who's helping me migrate the site from one thing to another. So we actually came together to think about how we might disseminate questions about mobilities. I wanted to make this, and the interesting thing about having what is a social science lab made it possible for me to actually begin to apply for funding too. So in very material terms, just bringing together a lab, calling it a lab in very, mercenary terms, it allowed me to begin to access resources both in my own university and elsewhere. So that became the collective became a place through which to access resources. I will say we do not have spatial resources yet, other than perhaps a little couch, but we haven't really needed it so far. But maybe at some point, we could. The benefit of this more virtual space has in fact been the lack of a physical space, or the absence of a physical space. So this has really been, just like we're doing here, this kind of mobile way in which to think about things. So the first thing we did to represent in some ways how we think of mobilities, at least in the scholarly sense, we set up what is this wonderful partnership with the New Books Network, which is a very widely listened to podcast series. And I'd like to thank, Sneha Annavarapu, who's now at Yale NUS, who is a master podcaster who actually helped us broker the partnership with Marshall Poe at the New Books Network. We do now have our own series. And that was a way for me to bring in young scholars who perhaps were not necessarily thinking about mobilities as an analytic, but I invited them in to become podcasters and speak with authors who are working with different methodologies, to study the mobile world in various ways. So that became sort of one of the first things we began. And in fact, we've been able to do a lot of dissemination through that partnership. And all of the folks who are part of this New Books podcast are in fact PhD students of mine. Alize Arijan is one of the master ones as well. She's now a postdoc at Rutgers University. And several of the other students who work with me have been doing the work on the New Books Network. And so if there's anyone here who would like to actually join those, and I always envision this lab to not just be a departmental level thing, but to bring in folks from young scholars who wanted to be introduced to how to learn certain kinds of skills, how to be exposed to different kinds of methodologies. We do actually invite people to write blogs for us. So we have a lot of content at the moment and a lot of ideas that are being migrated to a different website, which also, I'd love to hear from other people who are working on these kinds of things, how they manage to, move this space between one kind of portal and another. That's been a very big, a rather big challenge. The other purpose of our lab is also, we've also done, we also now, I have a partnership with Heidelberg University that's also doing work with artists in South Asia. So we've done a lot of collaborative workshops. So, the interesting thing is that as soon as I developed this, amorphous kind of space, it became a wonderful opportunity to interact and connect with scholars and artists that I perhaps may never have had opportunities to collaborate with otherwise. So we did a series of workshops as part of a DAAD grant with Heidelberg, working with artists to learn about ethnographic and methods of studying the city. So most of us associated with the lab are urbanists, though that may not necessarily always be the case. We are not, in fact, confined to ethnography. Anything we approach mobilities, we approach all of our work as ethnographers, certainly, but our methodologies are certainly not confined to ethnographic work. So we've been, a lot of the workshops and dissemination of methods that we've been doing have involved artistic practice, filmmaking, mathematical research, all kinds of things that might be, that are of value to our collaborators. The other thing that we're really interested in, actually, that I have been very committed to, is to doing not just collaborative projects, but also collaborative pedagogy. And I think a lot of the workshopping that I've done has come out of this need or this desire to develop collaborative pedagogy around mobilities. I myself have tested the waters. In my own city of Chicago, I now regularly teach a course with a colleague at another university, at the University of Chicago, where we've brought in students, and we actually have the students move between the campuses. And I'm hoping that we can actually develop these with others, not only in the region, but also with pedagogical partnerships elsewhere. And I think our institutions tend to have barriers to this kind of thing. But what I found is, as soon as I had as soon as I had an organization, this lab organization, it became much easier for me to, again, make a good case to my own institution and my own department as to the value of pedagogy, joint or collective pedagogy, particularly on this topic of mobilities, because I was able to make the case that we want people to move between campuses. We want people to be thinking about moving across continents when they're thinking pedagogically. And that there are benefits to that. So these are the sort of the three different ways in which our lab began. So we were specifically engaged with training. I would say this lab, the Mobilities and Methods Lab at UIC, is specifically focused on training, dissemination, and pedagogy. And of course, all of these will always be related to the scholarly research that we're doing. The other wonderful thing is, based on this lab site, I have now, of course, begun other colleagues in my own department. And again, my lab has been largely department-based, and I'd love to hear from other folks as to how I might scale this up. So other colleagues in my department have also now used the umbrella of the Mobilities and Methods Labs to access funding. So we now do have I'm collaborating with two of my colleagues who are archaeologists, who actually think of mobilities in a very different historical moment. And we're working on a project on rest stops along global roads in various parts of the world. And they are looking at it in kind of the archaeological record, whereas I'm looking at it in the contemporary record. And we are using this as a training for students as well. So the lab is very much about training of students in various different ways. And any of the faculty who want to be involved in this have to have a very significant training and dissemination, or we like to have them have a significant training and dissemination focus. And I would say that the last thing, in many ways, I'm sure, Melissa, this might resonate with you since you're in Silicon Valley. The lab has kind of been sort of like I don't know, we've been using kind of like a startup in some ways. We don't really have a lot of resources, but we're developing as a space through which to harness resources. The other thing we have done quite a bit of is actually consulting with non-academic organizations, especially transportation planning agencies in various places. We did do some consulting with folks in Mexico, some people in in South Asia, especially in India, when they were writing and trying to access funds and grants of their own for their own planning projects. They wanted some advice on how to do ethnographic work and more qualitative work. So we did also do some of that. So which falls under our dissemination and broader impacts mission. So I don't want to take up a whole lot more time, but I would just say that this lab is really focused a great deal on questions of training, questions of dissemination, questions of getting people to be thinking of mobility in broad ways. And this could be students, it could be external partners, it could be consulting agencies, which I have done actually quite a bit with as well, especially automobile companies. Melissa, maybe I'd love to hear a little bit more from you on that. So those are sort of the kinds of things that we're doing, and we would love to continue to scale up and collaborate more, but certainly our mission is largely focused on dissemination, pedagogy, and training of some in very, very broadly defined, and to bring in people who might not necessarily think of themselves as quote unquote mobilities scholars. My colleagues, for example, who are archaeologists, don't think of themselves as mobilities scholars, though they're working very closely with questions of infrastructure and movement and those sorts of things, but not in a contemporary context. Similarly with students, I've realized, many of my own undergraduate and graduate students don't, especially undergraduate students actually, because I do teach a large number of classes on human geography and critical geography, and we have lots of stuff that undergraduate students have been thinking about and developed, which I have to find ways to disseminate. I have not done that yet because I'm in the process of migrating our actual virtual space. But yeah, so this is really a way to involve students. I really want students and young scholars and young people, not just scholars, people who are going to go on to become artists or lawyers or whatever they end up doing, to be able to think about the socialities of movement in these different ways. So I'll just stop there, and I'd love to hear questions, comments from folks. So thank you so much. And I also want to say I appreciate many of my partners who are here. Doyen, thank you. Doyen was here. She wrote one of the first blogs on her way to Seoul. She traveled to South Korea, sort of right bang smack in the middle of the pandemic, and actually gave us some very interesting insights into what travel felt like when the rest of us were working on this Mobilities lab. So thank you for being here, Doyen. And I every day learn from folks who are, may not necessarily think of themselves as mobility scholars, but in fact are doing and thinking very sophisticated ways about mobilities. So thanks, and it's wonderful to see many familiar faces here as well.
Thank you, Tarini. Thank you, that's very interesting. So maybe Melissa, you can invite you to speak.
Yeah, that was so delightful to hear about all that work. I am going to try to share a presentation if I can. I've never seen this interface before. Interesting. Let me see if I can get this one going. And if I can't in a moment, then I'll just speak instead of share my slides. That didn't seem to work. I have a feeling that I've done a system upgrade recently, and it's interfering with what I can do here. Okay, well, I will no longer fiddle around with this. I'll just speak to you about what I prepared. So I represent, as you heard in the introduction, I guess a rather different perspective in being in the corporate sector. currently, and I'll give you a little bit of my background. So just by way of introduction, my pronouns are she, her. And I have worked in the private sector or nonprofit sector, but outside academia, at the intersection of academia for several decades now, almost always at the intersection with technology. And over the last 7 or 8 years, most directly with mobility, specifically transportation, vehicles, vehicular traffic, those sorts of things. So what I want to talk about is what it means to be at a place like Waymo, which you'll learn a little bit more about in a moment. And I'm very sorry that I can't get my slides up because I was going to do the full-on corporate, like, you know, the marketing stuff that was fully legit for me to show. And but anyway, but what I think of my key role as is bringing a lens of sociality to all aspects of transportation and mobility. So that means like paying attention to and helping like disturb what you would expect in Silicon Valley is a very kind of tech-centric way of thinking about things and thinking about through the lens of sociality much more fully. Before being at Waymo, just to round out the background, I did spend 5 years at Nissan Renault, so in a car company at their innovation lab in Silicon Valley. And before that at IBM and Sapient and various other places. And was actively involved for many years at the Ethnographic Praxis in Industry conference, EPIC, was a former president of that and co-chair of that. So have seen the large array of what kind of work people are doing at the intersection in industry. Also have had many wonderful partnerships with classes and students along the way. Jan English-Lewick is here. Thank you, Jan, for joining. And I've done things with her students at San Jose State University, with the University of North Texas, many times engaging student projects along the way, and also that I do hold a visiting scholar position at San Jose State University. So that's my introduction. But let's get to the question of like, why a social and behavioral scientist at a company like Waymo? So first, let's talk about Waymo. What is Waymo? Waymo, W-A-Y-M-O, kind of stands for, or it's what the name is to be suggestive of, is a new way forward. And specifically, the newness is in this idea of bringing about what Waymo refers to as the world's most experienced driver. So the company is involved in building autonomous driving technology with the mission and goal of trying to make it safe and easy for people to get where they're going. So for us, mobility really is, you know, in that realm of transportation and how to change it. And I think when I spoke with William earlier, that is, you know, one of the things that is a lens that I bring here today is a very, you know, obviously applied interventionist, hands-on in the arenas of making things happen here. So why does a company like Waymo exist in terms of, you know, what is the promise and benefit that is hoped for in autonomous driving technology? You know, I think that the thing that you hear of most often from the companies involved in developing the technology is a way to improve safety. We all know that there's a lot of human costs in the problems of transportation on the road. It can be in casualties, but it's also in the secondary and tertiary sort of cost of having problematic interactions on the road that can result in collision and all that. So the promise is that automated technology can address at least some of that. So that then has a bigger impact on society at broad, both on the safety front, but also I think for me, one of the things that really does motivate me in this space is that it's an opportunity to rethink from an environmental standpoint, the use of vehicles on the road. So you know, in the privileged aspect of a very well resourced organization, or coming out of a very well resourced organization, Waymo is our ancestor was the Google car company, Google self-driving car, and we are an Alphabet company, so we're in the world of Google, even though we are a separate company with separate funding. So very well resourced, but one of the opportunities then is to rethink kind of fleets of vehicles, and an opportunity to usher in a more environmentally friendly technology in the process. But not only that, I think if people underestimate the kind of waste and energy waste of just basic driving. Every time you slam on the brake or you accelerate fast, that's using extra energy. It then is necessary. So even shifting the mode of driving itself will actually have a significant impact on the environmental impact, even with combustion engine vehicles, and ideally shaping the way that the traffic and the roads work around us. And then there's the quality of life. I think one of the big selling points, and I think we all know as social analysts here, that you know, the answers are never in the technology. It's always in the social reconfigurations around things, and the political will and structures around that actually make change. But the potential that it opens up different sort of transportation opportunities for people who might not otherwise have them. And I'll be the first to say that, you know, again, very aware of the kind of privileged environment that we operate in, that I tended to discount the value of, for example, for a person with disabilities or sight impairedness or something like that. You know, why do they need their own private car to come? If we just paid drivers well enough and made it a reputable profession to be involved in transportation services, we could solve the problem of access and provisioning for people to be able to drive around, get where they need to go. We don't need the technology for that. But what I think I really underestimated is how significant and how unique and privileged it is for people to have the experience of a personal car trip and to be alone in that unique space of a vehicle. And so for people that it does open up from a personal safety standpoint, a sense of not relying on another person, there is some real sort of sense that that is a valuable possibility for some people. So there's all those aspects of sort of personal quality of life. So in terms of the autonomous driving technology, again, we haven't yet heard what is a social and behavioral scientist doing in this space. The technology itself is about building, so what we focus on at Waymo is to build the driver, not the vehicle. What that means is we're focused on the software development that could go in theory inside of any or many different kinds of vehicles to drive them, rather than the actual car and vehicle itself. And I will say this, for me, I feel much more comfortable here than I did in a car company, which a car company is ultimately always going to have to rely on selling more cars, which wasn't necessarily what I was most interested in seeing happen. But this is about building the technology for that driving action and behavior. So currently today, you can go to Chandler, Arizona, and open up an app and hail a Waymo car, and a car without a driver in it will appear. I think there's still some cars that have safety drivers in them, but there are places where the human driver is now completely out of the car. We have, you know, now decades of experience with real miles on the road to build and learn what it takes to have software learn how to do this and build the systems and the technology to enable such things. We're currently very actively testing in San Francisco and again in Arizona, but we've also driven and tested in 25 cities around the United States in all weather conditions and all these different sorts of configurations. And that factors into now to start to think about what is an anthropologist or behavioral scientist doing in these environments. One of the key questions that we explore is what is the same and different about moving about on roads in different kinds of contexts? And of course, at the core of that is, how do people see and experience the world. So our focus is very much in the everyday kind of phenomenological aspects of what movement experiences are like and feel like. And part of what we are focused on is to explore and bring about thinking of, you know, what is there something different and in what ways, and how instrumental and consequential is it for to be moving about in a vehicle in one place compared to another place. And what part of our job then is to bring that lens of what are the factors that matter that are not just the built environment, not just sort of straight infrastructural. I don't mean that in the wrong kind of way, but the sort of social lens of people's experience and expectations in different environments. So our group, just to say a little bit more about how we're organized and the extent of what we do, I'm in a user experience research team. We sit within a design team, so a user experience design and research. And we're part of a product organization. And trust me, I've been in the corporate world now for a long time, but I still have to like wrap my head around the implications of these kind of organizational configurations. But by being in the product group, it means that we're really, our job, you know, the sort of what we're paid to be here for is to help advance the building of the product, and the product again is that driver. And so, but we sit between many other parts of the organization, and the kinds of studies that we do are many. So first, who is the we in this picture? The we is about 12 or 13 researchers who bring backgrounds in cultural anthropology, behavioral economics, sociology, cognitive psychology, primatology, human emotion, human factors, business strategy across a wide range of disciplinary backgrounds, and a mix of both qualitative and quantitative, you know, people with qualitative and quantitative skills and focus and background. Some PhDs, many masters, and some, you know, BAs and BSs. The people that we work with, that we study as user experience researchers, are many. So most people assume that the key focus would be the rider inside the car. What is it like to get inside a car without a driver there? And what do people expect? And how do you support or respond to that experience? And that indeed is some of what people do. But we also focus a lot on what is the experience of all the publics that interact with us on the road without having asked to. You know, the people that are across from us at a four-way stop, the pedestrians walking in front of us, the bicyclists driving by, they didn't say, I'm a user of this autonomous technology, but in fact, they become interpolated into these environments. And beyond that, we also sort of pay a lot of attention to the interests and concerns of cities and policymakers. So we do work that informs that. And communities at large. So we have a fairly extensive focus and approach in looking out across, whether it's at neighborhood levels, different kinds of interest groups, what again concerns and opportunities may be in recognizing that we're putting ourselves into these environments and what's there. And we also do work with our internal colleagues to understand what the experience of, for example, a developer is, who's building all this software, or our safety drivers. Really interesting to spend time with those who actually are in these cars, driving them around, but they're not actually doing the driving, but they have to have a very close monitoring role and take over under certain circumstances, or take, you know, kind of, there's a lot of what they would call like a focused mission, where, you know, different days, there's different focused things that are happening. And so the role of those drivers can vary. So we will also do work that explores, you know, the experience and activity of them. So that's kind of how we're organized, to look across all those different kinds of user groups or stakeholder groups and explore and understand what kinds of needs they are doing. So just to list and name the examples of kinds of projects we might do. So my focus area, and I'll get back to this in a little bit more depth in a moment, is specifically on the way that vehicles interact on the road with all other road users, and what that experience of being in different kinds of traffic or road use environments is. And it's anything from looking at pedestrians and cyclists to imagining the people sitting at the sidewalk cafes, or the sanitation worker picking up whose job takes them on the road. But to understand from these multiple perspectives what that is like, or what the possibilities are for that kind of interaction. So just to continue though with this list of what things people in my group might focus on. So I've done a lot of work that gets very specific on things like pedestrian crossing behavior. How do pedestrians negotiate with vehicles? Who's turn order, turn taking? What kind of signals and implicit and explicit communication goes on? What's going to happen when you remove a driver from that? And how will that kind of negotiation actually occur? So I've done studies with drivers to understand how they see and interact with pedestrians. I've done studies of pedestrians to get a sense of how they navigate in these environments, again, in a quite kind of micro-focused kind of way. We might do studies of like narrow road negotiations. How do drivers that approach each other on a narrow road negotiate when one has to pull over and wait? How do you read the signals? What are the expectations? Again, are there variations of what's expected in different settings under different conditions? That would be another kind of project. The embodied practices of truck drivers. So we have a trucking division, and one of my colleagues who was going to be here today, but I don't think made it, is focused on, how do truck drivers do things like navigate different road conditions and, their different, the kinds of road users that they're interacting with, which is very different than it would be in a city. And how do they sort of live and embody that kind of experience, and how different or the same is it for long haul drivers versus those doing shorter regional trips? And so, our work does take us into the socio-political configurations, the economic sort of backbones of how these things are organized. As I already mentioned, we would do work on things like the community sentiment and experience of people by neighborhood, for example, in certain places. We had during COVID, there was a lot of work, of course, looking at kind of trust. COVID, of course, gave sort of a leg up to the autonomous technology environment, because the whole idea of getting in cars with strangers was, not preferred at the time. So the promise of self-driving became stronger then, but really, again, how were people navigating that and thinking about it? I already mentioned the safety driver experience. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of the breadth and range of the kinds of things we do. So to just spend my last couple of minutes here, and I'll be curious if I've missed the kinds of things you'd be most interested to learn about what we might be doing, but just to say a little bit more about the direct interactions with automated drivers, with a robot on the road, and why I lead within that broader user experience research team. I have a small team that I lead that focuses specifically on what we call driving behavior. And this is, how should that software operate? How should it behave? So I already described a situation of, for example, in interacting with pedestrians. The question would be, what kinds of expectations for negotiating turn order or moving about with vehicles in the midst, but with many others on the road. We're especially interested and focus a lot in urban settings and dense urban settings. So where and how might an anthropologist and behavioral scientist come into that? Well, to talk to that, let me just spend a couple of minutes laying out, like, what does this software, what does it require to do, and to give a sense of the complex feat involved. So the first thing that the software has to do is understand where it is. So where it is in an environment means, is it close to the curb? Is it in an intersection? Is it going through an intersection? If you think about traversing an intersection, it's very interesting because the lane markings go away. So how does a car know to move if it's turning left, for example? It's come from where it can see maybe lane markings on, or a curb on one side and a lane marking over here. Then it has to move through this unmarked area and wind up in the right place. So it has to know exactly where it is. And for this, there's been decades now of very in-depth mapping of the environment. But then the next thing it has to do is know what's around it. So what are not just the fixed objects, but all those moving objects, and who and what are those objects and things in the environment. Then it needs to predict what all those things are doing. So what makes this such an interesting feat, I think, for the technologist is these are just wildly dynamic environments, and there's a lot of stuff all going on at once. So you need, the car needs to know where, the driver needs to know where it is, what's around it, and then where all those things around it are going to be or what they might do next. So it's making all these predictions. And then the final thing is it needs to sort of decide what it should do. And so this is where it needs to make its plans and figure out. So this is where we can come in through that whole picture. Maybe not so much the where am I in the world, although we do see a lens of building in a social infrastructural lens into that picture, that to help to see about the possibility of, will it matter for a vehicle to understand where it is, not just by saying, I'm at an 4-lane road at an intersection with a signal in a city, but does it matter that it's in the financial district during commute hours compared to, let's say in the San Francisco area where I am, on the Great Highway out near the beach? Is there going to be a different set of practices and demeanors of sort of people and what's going on around, different tempos, rhythms of life? So even that where am I, will there be, or shall we consider building in kind of a social filter into that kind of understanding? What are people going to do, of course, is replete with all sorts of social assumptions, expectations. If I had my slides, I was going to show you. I'm always fond of showing. You guys can appreciate it because as anthropologists, you're deeply familiar, but just how different travel practices and interactional practices on the road are from place to place. So one of the jobs I have, I think, is to sort of defamiliarize technologists who, of course, this is Silicon Valley, they too come from everywhere and have had many experiences around the world, but to remind people in the moment about, interactional patterns can be deeply varied. And so this question of what's going to happen next is not just a behavioral, like what is the possibility of a body, which does matter. How fast might a person move? Do children move at a different speed? What about, the elderly or people with disabilities? The speed or direction or the possibility of where and how somebody's moving is very shaped from their physical abilities, but it's also very culturally embodied, our embodied selves, and how do we bring that? So, and then all the social norms and expectations. So a lot of attention to that space of how can we begin to suss out what might be happening. And then the main space that I do the work is in that kind of decision, what should we do? Because that's where you begin to have sort of a layer of building in expectations more fully about, what are appropriate means of interaction in different kinds of settings. What do we see now? And then what don't we see? So one of the things I spend a lot of time doing is trying to sort of disrupt this idea that just because something works a certain way today doesn't mean that it's ideally working that way, and that way of working is equally valuable to all. So, a lot is trying to bring in the more peripheral voices to say, maybe those kind of intersection interactions that people are engaged in is already a self-selected group of people who are comfortable being on a busy, aggressive road among a lot of vehicles that are, nudging their way through intersections. And the people who find that, risky, unpleasant, not the way they think that the environment should work, are just not showing up. So we're not going to see them working into that environment. So trying to bring in voices from different angles, that's where something like talking to sanitation workers who are in and out of vehicles all day long, or parking meter maids, to say, what is it like for you? What works and what doesn't work about these sorts of environments? So I think that I should wrap up. I probably rambled on quite some time. And again, I really apologize that I was unable to get my slides showing. But that's pretty much the space that we work in. And I'll look forward to your questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. So I'll ask then Biao to go ahead.
Thank you very much, William. And okay, I put our website on the chat room. Yep, if you can, please take a look. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I must say that our lab, the Mobility Lab, is the youngest and the smallest among the three. And I joined Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle in September, about less than half a year ago. We set up this lab on website slightly before that, but still we are really at the early stage of development. Of course, we call it a lab because we wanted to highlight a kind of spirit of experiment. The real matter, the matter that we really want to experiment with, actually is a question of accumulation. So the question of accumulation is important for us, at least for two reasons. Number one is a question of how we can make a mobility and a migration studies more cumulative. As we all know, in social science, in general, migration and mobility studies are really the lucky one. We do attract lots of attention, and it's relatively easy to get a grant on that topic. And of course, a large number of publications and research projects are being carried out or coming out, and many case studies. But at the same time, at least personally, I always feel that given the huge amount of material that migration and mobility scholars have collected, somehow we don't see any major insights emerging, major insights that will have broad impacts on how we understand the social change in the 21st century, for instance. And the accumulation question is important also for the discipline of anthropology in general. You know, the Clifford Geertz, as I say, he has always very interesting lines to offer. And he advised, in the splintered world, we have to address the splinters. He has an essay called The World in Pieces. So we have to look around all these fragments. Very true, we do have to look at each fragment. But shouldn't we also search for some unifying threads, some common concerns, and some ideas, theoretical ideas that will illuminate connections between these splinters, right? And this is not an entirely empirical question. Maybe it's true, there's no such thing as overall driving force in the world. But I think ideological, politically, and intellectually, sometimes it is a necessity for human society to have some unifying questions. And otherwise, the fragmentation just to carry on. So having unifying themes, questions, maybe is a way for intellectual intervention. I don't know, this is an open question, but in any case, I think it's interesting to experiment whether or not all the small fragments can be put together and build up something large. Let something large emerging from the small pieces. So this MOLAB, especially the MOLAB inventory, is proposed to serve this purpose. So we invite contributions of small entries written by scholars in different parts of the world about something that they observe that is taking place right now, but yet it is too early to be theorized, conceptualized in a stable format. Why don't you write quickly, report what you see and highlight some potential interesting points there, and we exchange, right? And put it in the inventory. So inventory in this sense is basically a platform as well as an incubator, in the sense that we exchange ideas and see whether or not the story, this data can build on each other and into something bigger. So as a way to tell you what we are actually doing, I want to share with you a bit of the history or the prehistory of the MOLAB. The whole thing started in, I think, March 2020, when I was still in Oxford. At that time, COVID was changing from a Chinese epidemic to a global pandemic. Of course, it's a very politically charged question. And everyone is engulfed in discussions. And I went to a Welcome the Trust conference. As some of you know, I think Welcome Trust is based in the UK, which mainly fund health and well-being related projects. And at that workshop, and suddenly came to my mind, actually, I've almost forgot, I did some research on SARS and the migration in 2003. Then I saw some interesting contrast between SARS and COVID, especially in terms of how government react to these epidemics. During SARS period, migration was an issue, but the main method that the Chinese government adopted was to mark migrants out, to separate the migrants from regular residents. So migrants are identified as a high-risk group, as a main target for intervention. But during COVID, migrant as a population was hardly mentioned in any policy at all, because the policies and measure is really targeting the entire population. It is more about the daily mobility, whether or not you can step up from your door or whether or not you can go to shopping and etc., rather than cross a region, a migration. So I thought, okay, it's something new. And actually, I was not too interested in mobility in general myself. But during the COVID, I saw, oh, now it's not only mobility has to be regulated, and also mobility itself will become a tool for regulation of other things. I mean, it's one example. During the COVID, we saw the measures like lockdown. But if you look at what kind of lockdown measures are more successful than others, all the successful lockdown measures are always accompanied by the redistribution of mobility. Some people stay home, but in order for these people, I mean, the majority of the population to stay home, you have to mobilize other people to move very fast. So key workers, delivery workers, etc. So therefore, you have a rapid rise of what we can call the mobility business, like Amazon and etc. I think what Melissa said is really fascinating. I think this is also what we saw during COVID. Mobility itself became a commodity. So it is not the vehicle, not the tools of mobility is a commodity, nor is it a service of mobility. It's not like, taxi driver bring you something and you pay the taxi driver for his or her mobile work. But now it is a driverless car. This is just the share a movement itself, right? The relocation of space itself become a commodity, and it is regarded as a source of profit. But yet, in order to do that, in order to turn this kind of now rather abstract, humanless mobility, it's autonomized mobility into commodity, as we just heard from Melissa's presentation, you do need to do lots of packaging. You have to regulate the passengers' perception and understand. You have to understand their perception and all the people around the car, how they see that. I assume in order to make such a new commodity socially acceptable and also sustainable, right, when it is rolled out. So therefore, there's a lot of packaging. So the mobility now becomes something quite different from what we know. I mean, that is emerged during COVID. So I thought that's all kind of interesting questions, observations, and how are we going to, I think it's fun to collect observation, put together and think and see whether or not there's something new emerging. So I set up a forum, I mean, in Oxford, I think it's still there probably. I mean, we don't have new submissions, but probably the archive is still there. It's called the Coronavirus and Mobility Forum in Oxford. And from there, then I moved to Max Planck, and I thought, okay, and I had a great experience with that forum. It's a huge, people are very enthusiastic, and I learned a great deal in a way that I never imagined, because it's very open. It's have a theme, but it's very open. You always see surprises, and it's very stimulating. Then we moved to Max Planck. So then I thought, okay, I'm probably it was good experience. I wanted to continue, but we have to do it slightly differently. I think is because in Oxford the forum is triggered by COVID, so it is very expensive. The charm was to look for surprises, something you didn't know, but now we want to move to something with a stronger emphasis on accumulation, to want to lead to something more stable. I always feel that stabilization, having an anchor, is quite important for social science in general and anthropology in particular, and probably mobility studies, especially in today's world. Otherwise, we all go to different directions. There's no stable common ground, not very productive in my experience. So therefore we designate a number of themes, try to as an anchor, as a thread that along which new ideas can be hopefully cultivated. So far, all these themes actually, if you visit the website, you can see they all have kind of direct roots, recognizable roots in COVID, including, I mentioned the kind of mobility business, and also linked and distributed mobility, which is related to the question of redistribution of mobility and the development of a new type of mobility infrastructure, etc. Like all kind of apps and etc. in order to make a mobility safe, but also still allow you to move, right? Things like that. It has its roots in mobility, COVID, but of course we will have to move on. So that is the main purpose, is to make the mobility more cumulative and try to find something big that will go beyond the mobility cases itself. So therefore, it immediately raises a challenge. I want to hear your advice, and namely, how should we suggest the themes, designate themes. So far, it is coming from our prehistory, our relation with COVID, and then from now on, is there any systematic way to identify good themes? But the themes is not permanent. I think one theme can last for 2 years. Once we develop enough good ideas, then we let the idea to go out to the academic world to be circulated, right? Because our inventory is like an incubator. We just have seeds, and we let the little seedling grow, a little seedling, and we then plant it outside. But still have a question of how, at one particular moment of time, we cannot have too many themes. So how should we identify the 4 or 5 themes? That is a practical question. And then second practical question is, how should we solicit these materials, the entries? And some of you have really contributed very interesting and important entries, but how can we go forward, get quality submissions. I mean, of course, we are lucky that with support from Max Planck Institute, we are able to assign all entries a DOI number. This means that all the entries can be counted as formal publications and therefore fully searchable and permanently searchable and fully quotable. So people will have to cite you. It is, I mean, this really go back to the question we want to serve as a more or less a stable anchor for knowledge accumulation and exchange. But still the question, how can we solicit submissions? And the third practical question is that we have to face and think through is how can we, I think is the most important one, is how can we develop big ideas from this case observations, even not the case of studies, right? Because that is the whole point. If we just accumulate lots of fragments or splinters in geared words, then it's not very helpful. We have to bring all the splinters together and build some bigger sticks. So we are thinking, okay, probably we can support certain, thematic workshops and bring different pieces, authors together to talk to each other to develop something. I mean, we don't know. I mean, so we haven't done that yet. No, we hopefully in this year, next year, we wanted to experiment with some of these efforts, to cultivate big ideas. So finally, it's Tarini, so the lab, as she mentioned, has a very strong pedagogical dimensions. We are less so. We don't provide training, or we don't focus on methodological reflection. I mean, we may do some, I think, in the future, but probably that is not our niche. But nevertheless, I do have a strong interest in developing, making the inventory, our mobility lab, pedagogically useful. And this goes back to my own experiences as a lecturer in Oxford, teaching the MS Master's program in migration studies. Master students in Oxford, it's scandalous, it's 9 months long, but yet, students are expected to demonstrate their originality in making good analysis. I mean, 9 months, they can't do any field work. You can't have primary resources. How can you write anything original? So most students go do media studies. They just look at all the news reports and see how migrants are portrayed in news, etc. But that is limited, right? The space for students to exercise their intellectual ability is limited. Then I'm hoping the entries in our inventory as a kind of organized primary sources, information, may be useful for master students or senior undergraduate students when they develop their dissertations. So there is a plenty of space for them to reinterpret, to reorganize the material, to develop a distinct and possibly original arguments. So, so that we have a metaphor, we wanted to make all the entries like bricks and a clay, maybe not a hard bricks, it's even clay, it's still soft, clay doughs, and you can reshape and then you put together, build something according to your own understanding. So the coming year will be critical for us, and we, number one, we want to consolidate our own kind of cumulative project, to make it more cumulative and build bigger ideas out of small pieces. But at the same time, we also, but probably after that, we also wanted to reach out to build partnerships. And this is because without the partnerships, we feel that the research exchange or this pedagogical applications of the material may not be sustainable. We cannot stay there and just be open and hoping the world will make use of our material and people will contribute. Probably not. We may have to develop a certain strategic partnerships with some groups and institutions. And of course, this is why today's event is especially valuable for me, because I already, probably many of you here will be our potential partners. Yeah. So William, I will stop here. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, this is quite fascinating. I hope, I think everyone has probably found something interesting. Yeah. Yeah, sorry we can't clap like in person, all of us together. But yeah, but you have the symbols. So yeah, there are like too many threads and connecting things and open kind of questions. So I think maybe, given, I think, we have like manageable time and amount of people. So maybe, maybe if Tarini, Melissa, and Biao, you have some questions for each other or just reactions to each other, you could actually go ahead while it's still relatively fresh. And then we can, open it up for discussion or see what things kind of come out of that, if that sounds reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah, William, can I ask a question? Yeah, okay. So yeah, Tarini, I'm very interested in knowing a little more about the mobility as a method. I mean, your lab serve as a kind of recruitment agent, right, to convert innocent graduate students into mobility scholars. So I just wonder how exactly you do that. Your pedagogical the function, how is that implemented? You organize a number of reading groups or some method workshops, or then you also have open calls for anyone whose research is related to migration and mobility come together, or yeah, any practical activities?
Yeah, no, thanks, Biao, for that question. And I've learned so much from what you all are doing as well. So we, a lot of the practical, the material things that we have been doing are inviting people to certainly workshops, right? And a lot of this actually came out of the reality. It's not just students, it's also my colleagues on my campus who are thinking about methods in different ways. And, it's so interesting that you also said, MOLAB has certain connections to March 2020. And I think this is an interesting thing for all of us in many ways that, COVID, especially in the academic setting, I mean, Melissa, of course, has been doing this kind of work for a long time. But for us in the university setting, there was something that happened in 2020, which needed perhaps different ways of thinking about our pedagogy, but also supporting people who wanted to use different kinds of methods and things like that when they were no longer mobile, right? So we started in material terms, we had all of these graduate students and colleagues who were conceiving of projects, were trying to come up with new projects or new research, and really wanted a space to discuss methodologies, right? And when I say methodologies, obviously in anthropology, what I love about mobility studies, actually, in many ways, is I find myself in rooms with people I would never otherwise find myself with, right? Not just anthropologists, it's really people who are coming at this from many, many different places, especially things like transportation planners. With the kind of work I do, I've really learned a lot from people who actually, civil engineers who are actually building bridges and roads, planners who actually have to make stuff work, as opposed to, anthropologists who we raise a lot of interesting questions. Planners begin, and a lot of people planners and engineers, I find, once the problem is resolved, that's where the project ends. But for us, it's really, the project only begins, the questioning begins once the project ends. So we had all these people who were interested in thinking about different ways of approaching their work in methods. We have a very large, on our campus, a transportation center. So just, shorthand for this is that I think that we ended up doing some workshops. People wanted to, think about different ways in which to use mobile methods, use digital methods in their research. So we organized a bunch of those kinds of collective workshops. We also have been doing some collective publishing and writing. I brought in several of my own undergraduate students, who are interested in thinking about, who were tracking what was happening in their own neighborhoods, how their neighborhoods were moving during COVID, and what was shutting down, what was opening up, those kinds of things. So I also did several small little workshops with undergraduate students to help them think in these kind of more mobilities terms, rather than, because there's a lot of these things, these analytics that people are more familiar with, displacement and these kinds of things. So to think about displacement in terms of mobilities, to think about what's happening around you in terms of what's moving, what kinds of folks are moving in and out of neighborhoods. I work on an urban campus where, we have lots and lots of people who are, immigrants, migrants, lots and lots of students who are first generation students who are always talking about questions of social mobility. So we brought in all of these other kinds of ways in which to think about these. So I would say mostly workshops, reading groups. We worked very closely with people who were trying to develop research proposals that wanted to think about methods in different ways. So so grant development was a very big part of this project, both for scholarly grants and, as I said, planners and others who were trying to develop grants. We actually helped them with those kinds of things as well. So yeah, I would say it was largely workshopping and also, the reason we have this New Books Network podcast is that a lot of our a lot of people outside of academics and a lot of my students didn't really want to read these books on methods, but they listened to the podcast. And I will say it actually made a very big difference to how they started to think about this. So, I'm not, obviously I'm committed to kind of serious anthropological and analytical work. But at the same time, I'm also committed to the fact that, there's lots of people who, who will never become anthropologists, who are, but who will go out into the world to build bridges and to build cars and to, become, public defenders, those kinds of things. So I really wanted to find a way to get people interested in thinking about these things, no matter what they end up doing in life. So that's really where my pedagogical commitments came from. And those are kind of the material things that we did. But I'd love to see more and, teaching. So our lab also became a repository for, there's people teaching about mobilities all over the world. So we actually became a repository for syllabi as well. In fact, Doyen, who's here, actually collected syllabi from various different places. So, if someone says, look, I want to teach a course on mobilities, or I want to teach a course on mobility justice, or, the sociality of mobilities, or disability, access, those kinds of things. So we actually have a repository of those kinds of things that people might be interested in if they're developing their own pedagogy on their own universities. So that was another thing that became part of this pedagogical component. So yeah. I'm sorry, that was a long answer to a simple question, but I appreciate it because it makes me think about what it is we actually did. And we did a lot of scrappy things, but so having this discussion actually helps us think about how we might bring these things together in more coherent ways.
Please go ahead.
Was that me? Perfect. So I have a question for Biao. First of all, these were a delight to hear what both your labs are up to and how to think of those connections. I'm curious. I was very struck by your aspiration to, I wrote down some of the language you use, but to build bigger things and to really have insights that land and sort of shift, I guess, well, maybe that's my question. What is it you think that needs to be shifted? And the idea of making those small splinters come back together into something larger, who do you feel is your audience for that? Like, what is it you're hoping to affect? And then the second part of it is, do you think that the theorization that, you know, by having themes and then having a lens of theorization, and this maybe is a question for anybody here, you know, is it mobility itself or mobilities as a lens that you think the change or the opportunity lies in? Or is it some piece of that? Does it come from within? So it's not a very clear question, but I was just so struck by how clearly you are focused on wanting to have this bigger impact. And I guess I want to know a little bit more about that and where you think that might come from.
Thank you very much, Melissa. As you put it, it's the inspiration and or aspiration. You know, it's things that we wanted to explore, and how and what we'll get. It's really, we don't know. We may fail, may well fail. But your second question first, I mean, both the questions actually are really spot on. The first question, what is the specificity about the mobilities for such a project of building big ideas from small pieces? I think mobility is very special because mobility is itself very mundane, practical, and is not directly dictated by any institutional or structural forces, because I mean, human agency must play a role in mobility, right? And yet, this is places that mobility, namely, where lots of changes are taking place right now. And these changes, we will call it a kind of, it's operational changes or changing at the operational level, not in a structural or institutional level, but just in terms of how things operate, how things function, how one step leads to next step. It's often, appear to be kind of very technical. But this, I suppose, is a feature of how society is changing in 21st century. And as a world, there's a fire. As I can see, there is no clear gravity, and there is no clear direction of the whole society, human history, where it's going to. But we have lots and lots of these operational changes here and there. So the question is, I mean, so mobility is a very good lens. And the question is whether or not there's a connection between them, and I don't think the connection can be found out purely empirically. So connection must be discerned and often imagined through theories. But in order to do that, we do need a large amount of small pieces to put to be in front of us. Then we can start imagining to discern a pattern that emerges from the small pieces. So that is why mobility can be useful. And of course, I mean, the mobility lab is a part of our department. Our main focus is so-called economic experimentation, new way of organizing socio-economic relations. But mobility is a special lens to explore that changes that it's hard to predict beforehand. And the second question, who is the audience for such an effort? The mobility lab itself actually is very much oriented to researchers and relatively advanced students only. I mean, in the beginning, I did hope that MOLAB will become a platform where practitioners, journalists, or researchers meet. But so far, it looks not very realistic. So probably tentatively, at this stage, we think, okay, probably we focus on accumulation of knowledge and idea development first among academic researchers. And then later on, let the ideas travel afterwards. So the inventory is an incubator. And for mobility is like that. But for the whole department, actually, that is really, you're touching the core of our concern, is that we wish to reorient our research mainly by identifying a new kind, by clarifying who we write for, who our audience will be. We wanted to do research that will speak to, well, if I give a kind of a demographic profile, would be college-educated youth in largely cities, but some rural towns as well, in the global south. That would be our imagined main audience. And these people, they are educated, they have actually no problem in reading quite theoretical texts. I mean, they just don't want to read all these, American anthropologist journal articles, but they are quite happy to read some books. And they are thinking, they are demanding explanation about their life. They have lots of questions. They feel, the pressure of work is increasing, and they feel that also life is full of pressure. And they are asking the question of meaning and etc. I mean, it's based on my, the engagement with the Chinese youth and also my own research with the Indian youth. It's very clear. The materially, people's living standard has been increasing very clearly in the global south. So it's not really a story of misery for many of them, but it's really a story about question. And then they're asking where we are going to, right? So how can we translate all the concerns about climate change into practical ways to reorganize our life? And how can we develop a way to look at life, that life is so meaningful, even though the GDP is declining, even though we know we are not having more material possessions next year, but we still look forward to next year. I mean, what kind of languages and the cultural imaginaries that we can provide for the young people? That is type of research we wanted to do. And in order to do that, I feel, and I hope it's shared by my colleagues, some of them are here, you do need some kind of big thinking. Otherwise, you just focus on case and you say, oh, people have all kinds of different diverse views. People are very sensitive. People are full agency. They interpret this circumstance in their own ways. It does not really address people's need, because people don't need to be told they are full of agency, they are clever. They know they are clever, but they demand a big explanation about the world. So this is why I feel certain kind of even artificially unifying ideas are just politically necessary. Yeah.
So I don't know if Tarini, you wanted to raise anything before we go out, or just to, just
well,
to get
I have a couple of questions. Thank you, Biao. That was, I really do, that's really an amazingly interesting response. And I love the way you're thinking about this. You use these metaphors of the splinter and how do you bring these together. And so, yeah, I guess in pragmatic terms, and I see, I see as someone who works in the global south too, is that these are, these kinds of aspirations and these desires are really important, and those are wonderful audiences. Do you see contributions to these, the splinters, the more immediate writing? And I love this way in which you're thinking about the immediacy of the writing, these pieces that you're inviting into the incubator. Are you finding, educated experts from the global south as contributors to this? I'm wondering, because this is another thing I've been thinking quite a lot about as well, is that, how do you get people who are, you know, smart, thinking, educated people in the global South, to be able to intervene so that it's not just this flow of splinters from us sitting in the, you know, the global North. What are some of the ways that you might suggest that many of us can do that kind of thing?
Well, Tarini, this is a wonderful question. Again, it's touched, you know, our heart and soul here. Absolutely, I think it's very important. I mean, it's not a way I just want to be politically correct. I mean, if you look around the world, what is, you know, just to be let's be a nerd, and just as a nerd, we ask, okay, what would be interesting idea come from? What will be the driving force, the engine that we see things differently, and where people are doing things in interesting ways, right? Yeah. Of course, it's a global South, and there's a size of population and all kinds of experiments and etc. So absolutely, that's critical, and we are committed to that. And so far, we have done quite a few, and especially from India and China. And the way we did it is through, at the early stage, through commission. We identified scholars through introduction, and that is tied to the earlier COVID project. And we provide a very small amount of fund, and we suggest topics, and that, of course, they are experts on these issues already. And so they write about a number of pieces about COVID, you know, how India brought back a large number of migrants from the Middle East, and this repatriation campaign, how it was organized. And it's quite interesting for us to understand, you know, it's how a sovereignty sees this moment to make a claim, right? And then at the same time, the internal migrants in India suffered a great deal due to the lockdown, without a proper measure, accompanying measure of redistributing mobility. This is a lesson I learned by comparing India and China as well. In the total lockdown, and without any other channel for allow people to move for those who need, then it's a disaster. Then you create all this massive flight. So we have pieces from India and China. So I mean, then we must work together how to move this forward. And here I also hope that we will make a small intervention. Again, this as a kind of as an aspiration. In anthropology writing, I feel many scholars, students in the global South, they do not contribute as much as they should, partly because they, I think, are constrained by this, you know, prevalent and dominant way of writing. They always feel if you write, you have to have this kind of clear framework and all this very clear technical definition of this term and that term, and you have to sound smart and etc., rather than just straightforwardly report what you see and tell us why you feel that is important, interesting, or worrying. So I think it's the part, I mean, it's a quite important project for us actually to cultivate this type of confidence of writing and the reporting. So I hope, you know, our inventory on one hand, we can have DOI numbers, and at the same time, it's not like a journal. We can be quite liberal and encouraging different styles of writing. Yeah. So, and that's the next step we wanted to explore, is we probably needed to develop a certain partnership with institutions in Global South and use them as brokers and bridges and to reach. I mean, I would really need your advice as well.
Yeah, that's such a great idea. And I'm wondering if one might even, I mean, I know that we do need to be, you know, you're developing this, you know, the written word, perhaps in English. I'm wondering if we might even, because I've been thinking a lot actually about questions of, you know, translation. You know, I work in India where there's, you know, several languages, and how we might even work back and forth across written work in different languages, maybe oral, or going back to oratory in some ways of observation. And that's why I've really, you know, I know that I keep harping on questions of podcasts, but I think it becomes a way for people to express ideas in conversation, perhaps, that may not happen in writing. I don't know. So I think that's,
yeah,
there's so many things to think about. Yeah.
Exactly. We have our YouTube channel of video conversations, and now we are thinking of a podcast. And then I think some pieces in our MOLAB inventory, and certainly a few in the Oxford Forum were co-published with the largest Chinese kind of serious news and intellectual website called The Paper. Yeah, so we do kind of parallel co-publishing experiment, but that stopped. But definitely, yeah, multilingual and multimedia publication is on radar.
Yeah, so I think we can, you know, open it up if people have questions or just reflections or comments or whatever. You can please put it in the chat or raise your hand. I think Andrew has his hand, I see. Yeah. Please, Andrew, go ahead.
Yes, and I think the idea, it's a great idea to maybe collect a few questions, and then whoever wants to respond can pick out what sounds interesting to them, and it's a nice way to go. So thank you for the conversation thus far. I've been finding it absolutely fascinating, and part of what this series has up until this point been interested in is thinking about the lab form as a particular kind of form. And we can already see today what that form has enabled for each three of the presenters, right? For Tarini, it really kind of enabled a unique pedagogical space that you didn't even, it almost sounded like people didn't know they needed it until it was there. And then they all, you know, kind of came together. And for Biao, I'm also thinking, you know, about the kind of interesting platforms and people that you're looking to attract. So one of the things that has been interesting kind of to cumulatively listen to people from a variety of different labs is the role of experimentation and what that actually means. And so for Biao, it was very interesting to imagine, so it really sounds like, and I'm very kind of interested in this idea that mobility studies to some degree is a mature research body, right? Like lots of people have been doing lots of research on this, and we have reached a kind of maturity. Maybe we're not at the beginning. And so we might want to try and think about things and common themes, etc. And so I wonder, so much of experimentation pushes towards finding something new, right? So we want to push for the new. We want to push for the undiscovered, the hidden, the whatever it is that might be out there that we haven't yet done. And yet it almost seems like your project is about identifying not the new, but the common. And I'm wondering if you see a role for experimentation, but it's a slightly different one, or for what you're looking to do. On the question of experimentation for Tarini, I was also interested in the limits of experimentation. So you've been thinking about kind of experimenting pedagogically. Have you kind of found experiments whose end result is we're not going to do that again? I think that happens for all of us often, but it's really useful, right? I think it's not always about, you know, I think that's part of the value of playing around. And for Melissa, also on this issue of experimentation, one of the things that popped out into my head as I was listening to you talk was to think about how all of the various bits and pieces that your group is involved in would or would not translate well to a different cultural context, right? So, you know, you're imagining mobility and all these different problems, probably in a very much a North American urban environment. Maybe I'm overstating that case. So I'm wondering if part of your experimental practice is also to document the forms of experimentation and to imagine that as a possible model that could be replicated by another team in a different cultural context. Now, maybe that's proprietary information and you wouldn't do that anyway because it's the private sector, but it does strike me that one of the interesting possibilities for experimentation is to kind of be reflexive about what works and what doesn't work, and that itself becomes something that you could then take and carry out elsewhere. So in other words, it's one of the products of your process, the refined process itself. Again, just kind of interested in how experimentation works. That was long-winded. I'm going to be quiet now and let others ask questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have 2 questions in the chat, and I have a question. I can't raise my hand for some reason. So maybe I'll just quickly state mine and I'll read the other ones, but you should be able to read them in the chat so you don't have to remember them. I think my question is similar, I mean, in a way similar to Andrew's about this question of the common, but I think there's a kind of question about, I mean, I don't know, maybe I tend to sort of think about this in almost like a structuralist way. So I'm kind of curious, like as mobility seems to become a kind of category that we want to generalize in certain ways, or to become a generalized image of some kind of set of relations, which is different in each one, right? I think to some extent, say Biao, there's a question of a common theme, which is actually a political ideological question, not necessarily like a epistemological generalization. And then with the driver, the automated driver, it's a kind of very interesting sense of the driver as a kind of platform, and like what does it mean to distribute the body and agency of the driver into like a space. Like it becomes a space infused with like predictive interpretation or something. And then with the Mobility and Methods Lab, like this very strong way that the pedagogical nature of it sort of projects a certain kind of sociality, especially in the expansion beyond the, you know, the sort of specialist researcher as a target, and the kind of people who not only are targeted as an audience, but who inform the infrastructure of the conceptualizations. So I think there's something interesting in that I was curious about. You know, if this is the way we kind of look at it, do you have a sense of like what would be the kind of terms that we might set against mobility? So like an easy one that emerges, you know, at some point is like mobility and immobility as a kind of distributive phenomenon. But like, or I think maybe Tarini had mentioned like, you know, we have these ideas of like displacement and so forth, which are like, you know, spatial / movement metaphors. But I was just curious if in this movement into looking at mobility as a very generalizable kind of figure, which sort of starts to organize other kinds of concepts and relations, like what would be the things which are like, say, not mobility, or, you know, mobility interacts with, which are autonomous kinds of forces maybe. This is more a speculative question, but it's just something that I thought of. Then just to read these questions, Bhumika has a question, invitation to the speakers. What are the limits and possibilities of studying mobilities comparatively, especially when the specificity of mobility and the universality of mobility is increasingly relevant to all of us? And then Bronwyn has a question, which is specifically for Melissa, so I'll just read it. It's about this, so Uber sold its self-driving division to Aurora in 2020. What's your insight or educated guess on why they did that? It's not like a lack of profit is a problem for Uber per se. Is it just because a self-driving car wasn't developing fast enough to help them grow, for example? So yeah, so I invite the panelists to respond as you like to this kind of broad field of questions.
I'm happy to chime in. I'll start with the question about experimentation from you, Andrew, and I think that's it's interesting. Just to give a flavor of the kind of worlds I move in, that when you put experimentation together in our arena, most often what I have to contend with and integrate are experimental methods in the more classic sense of like coming through experimental psychology or cognitive sciences or any other experimental sciences where, you know, you're doing controlled or semi-controlled studies that are experiments of some kind or another. And that's to render, you know, quantitative results, measurable kind of data that is going to be lasting. And, you know, and people often have been confused in the course of my career about like, well, an anthropologist, I say it's a very experimental science as well. It's or experimental methods and approach to understanding, and they want to sort of bucket it into that same set of approaches. And so to be able to suss out and discern across the social sciences and humanities the different kinds of approaches, social sciences in particular, you know, what might an experiment mean and what does it mean to be experimental? I would also say that, though, that, you know, among the ethnographers and from various disciplinary backgrounds who have been involved in this world at the intersection with industry and all, you know, have been very scrappy and creative in finding ways of doing work in so-called new and experimental ways. And I think it's been a kind of heightened, you could almost say fetishized approach or interest to like come up with some new method. I know there's been like some of the small anthropological consultancies will have like a goal of saying you're going to try something new. Every project has to have at least one new thing that it's trying to do. And, you know, awards for like the most experimental and wacky way of going after things. So I do think there is a lot of that. The question though of like export. So, you know, if you saw how we actually did our work, you know, we were fielding studies in the manner that we do. It's not year-long ethnographic studies completely, although, for example, for me in my work now for many years, looking at other road users, pedestrians and cyclists and all, you know, over time coming at different questions in different ways is building into a sense of that everyday, you know, ambulatory practices in urban settings and what that means to people and how they navigate it. And also, like, my personal agenda involves ethnography that might be worthy of a more anthropological or academic sort of meaning. But within the work that we do, you know, there's a lot of creative methods that we would use, and we're continuing to field studies all throughout COVID, which took enormous amounts of operational like configuration, getting cameras to people to like do self-recorded methods and all sorts of things, a lot of you know, sort of self-capture for people's thoughts or experiences. So I think that as a lab, for sure, the desire to make visible and share kind of various of these approaches. And I think that, I guess the more direct answer is to say, I do think that we do face on a regular basis, although you're right that Waymo in particular, I'll say this, Waymo in particular so far is a North American company that's focused on the North American market. But before that, I was at Nissan Renault, which has, you know, cars across the Nissan Renault Alliance are going to be in 170 countries around the world. I mean, very global from the get-go, thinking about sort of things across different levels. So it's been an interesting switch to have that switch of lens. But I do think that, you know, trying to put things out to say, here's parts of what's worked and what's not, and already having had to confront like failures of different ways of thinking methodologically, but also how we construct the object of our study and what we think that means and what's important. Just a little snippet on that. I did a study years ago. If I shouldn't say a study, we do little dips of investigation when I travel often. So I was at the EPIC conference in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and tacked on some time to spend with some local researchers on the streets of Sao Paulo, doing some study there. And, you know, just the frame of like thinking, we would ask about safety. and if you had seen my slides, but you recall that for like a transportation organization, safety is going to be like not having crashes, right? Not having collisions. Immediately, the safety question took us in so many other directions about, you know, personal safety, about kind of the setup of the city and what kinds of environments, how people sort of moved for their own sense of like where it was and wasn't comfortable and how it was and wasn't comfortable. So, you know, it was very quick to be able to sort of ascertain that, you know, the notion of safety doesn't sort of translate directly like that. So long-winded answer, I'll just briefly say on the question in the chat. You know, I think that these industry alliances, I'm still like, I think my main topic of study continues to be like the organization, the company, the enterprise, this weird beast of, you know, capitalism that we find ourselves in. You know, the name of the game is often these like building and shifting alliances and across industry partners and like deciding where to focus attention and where not to, and how like it's partly partnership opportunities to sort of build, like if we don't try to focus in this area, then it's going to allow an alliance because we'll need that focus, but meanwhile somebody's going to need our specialization. So I won't say specifically what I think. I can't really, I don't want to speak directly to what was going on for Uber, but for sure, alliances and partnerships in industry is the name of the game. It's how you get things done. That's what you want to build and sustain. And of course, you know, you are, you know, whether there seems to be money at hand or not, the factoring about where to invest over the long haul is certainly, and developing automated vehicles is not for the faint of heart when it comes to the sort of resource investment and what it will take to scale in a more complete fashion. So a couple of thoughts there.
Andrew, I'll just take really quickly. Thank you. And maybe this responds to the question in the chat from Bhumika as well. You know, you asked this question about experimentation and common, you know, what is common? And I think that this is extremely provocative, actually. So thank you, you know, Biao, also for raising this question of how do you come up with common themes, and you know, you're committed to a certain kind of accumulation, understanding of accumulation as knowledge is accumulation, and all of these other accumulations. And I also, you know, I really, as far as the experiment, at least the pedagogical experiment that we have been very committed to, is that I actually think in many ways that thinking about mobilities, and I'm not necessarily, you know, attached to that term, but just thinking about the concept, I think is an accumulative form of knowledge, because it also actually becomes a way, at least pedagogically, to reflect on all kinds of experiences, you know, vendors, beggars, automobile drivers, commuters on public transit, migrants, tourists. So mobility, for me, at least pedagogically, becomes an accumulative space. And it's also importantly a methodological space, because being mobile as an ethnographer or any other kind of researcher actually creates all kinds of other perspectives on how we research, how we think, how we deliberate, and ultimately how we write. So I would say that my experiments, I think of kind of mobilities and the lab that we're trying to you know, sustain, to essentially provide people who are involved with a toolbox, not of just mobilities as an analytic, but a toolbox that actually allows you to put these lots of diverse concepts and methods into it, where you can, in fact, think about entanglements, disconnectivities, you know, how things move, how things come to a halt in order to respond to Bhumika, how things speed up, and then actually to really encourage people to think seriously about their own mobilities and their own embodiment as people who move around the world. And this, you know, Biao mentioned mobilities is mundane. So I find the experiment pedagogically has been very useful for me, because it is something mundane. and I can actually engage people pedagogically in kind of experiential work around my city. How do they move? How do you, how can you think like that? So I would say the experiment is really to create a toolbox. And, I think that I certainly have approached this, since I've approached this pedagogically, I've been making baby steps to find the limits of this experimentation. And certainly, at this point, I feel as though, the experiment has, I think pedagogically, I'm not sure yet what those limits might be. Analytically, I think there can be limits, but at the same time, I feel that this accumulative way of thinking can essentially open up pedagogical experiments that might not be possible if I was, say, doing something on urban studies per se, or transportation, or kinship. All of these things are things I myself am interested in, but I feel I can bring them all together under this kind of accumulative umbrella of mobilities, even though I may not necessarily be terribly attached to the term, but I feel like it's a way to bring in different kinds of experiments. So it's kind of an experiment. Okay, Andrew, maybe I would say it's maybe an experimental form itself, thinking with mobilities. And yeah, I won't say I've had huge successes every time, but I feel like that it's, if one wants to experiment, this has been a useful way that I have found to experiment in ways that I haven't found any other broad analytical or methodological or pedagogical toolbox.
William, should Doyen go first?
I was actually writing my questions/comments. So would it be better to post it on the chat, or should I just speak it out loud?
Yeah, probably speak out. The people want to hear you, right?
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. Yeah, I mean, like, I just wanted to thank all the presenters for this inspiring and wonderful.
Just Melissa has to step away, so I just wanted to say thank you
Oh,
so much.
Just thank you. I'm sorry, I have another meeting that started that I have to jump into, but thank you so much. I really enjoyed learning about your labs and the work.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
have a good day. Thank you.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, so this has been really wonderful, and I just wanted to share my experience at the MML, which is the Mobilities Methods Lab at UIC with Dr. Bedi. And as Dr. Bedi had mentioned, I had a chance to write a blog post about my mobile experience during the peak of the COVID, which was August 2020. And, like I wrote field notes based on my emotions and observations of being in a plane with only 5 to 6 passengers and being locked in a hotel room for 2 weeks due to the government measures. And at the moment, like travelers were regarded as, like potential threats at the time to the Korean government's successful quarantine measures. So I just wanted to say that, like writing a blog post was actually really helpful in thinking of, like how, my own experience and possibly ethnographic experiences can actually have impacts on thinking about mobility during the time of COVID-19. And actually, I had a question to ask to Dr. Cefkin, but I think I can maybe, like ask her my question, like later by email or so. So yeah, I just wanted to share my experience. Yeah.
Yeah. That's William. I want to thank you, Doyen. Yeah, and then just I think in interest of time, probably very brief responses to the question. Number one, to William and to Bhumika's question. I think I really share what Tarini said, and it's a kind of mobility for me is not a subject matter. We don't want to study the type of mobility or structural mobility So therefore, I have some reservation about such a thing as a comparative studies of mobility, because in order to do comparative study mobility, you have to stabilize or even normalize mobility as a category of study. But this is not what we really do. As Tarini put it so nicely, it is a kind of mobility is a experimental form to think ways, or probably we can imagine it as a handle, or it's a holding place, right? It's a kind of empirical hermeneutics or something, right? It's a facilitate other type of question, and we're not interested in mobility per se. So whether or not it's becoming too general or not is so far has not bothered me. What really bothered me is that what is our substantive question we want to explore through mobility? If we don't have that question, we just chase mobility, then you of course are bound to get very confused and you will be lost. The mobility itself as an empirical phenomenon is just completely shapeless. It's changing all the time. So Andrew's point, again, I mean, that is so important, is the question of we are looking for something common or looking for something new. Very true, we don't look for something new. I mean, of course, we don't want to repeat what has been said before, but more importantly, we want to dig deeper and see connections. So it's like, I don't know the English word, in all these wells in desert, you have to dig very deep. Then the different wells are actually connected because the underground water itself is one body. So what we want to do is to dig this well in desert to see the underground connections. And then you have a kind of new understanding, but being innovative itself is not our goal at all. So therefore, the question is not about the discovery, and the question is about theorization. This is why theory becomes so important. And the theorization, of course, as a kind of social practice. It's not just to invent a new concept, but you want to, you have a certain purpose, right, to find out the connection between these two wells. I mean, that is mainly determined by your perception of the world. It's beyond the academic exercise itself. So finally, what is experimentation about for us? For me, I'm sorry, it's a vulgar answer. It's nothing but a legitimation for being undisciplined, for being maverick, for being daring enough to fail. When we say experiment, we can say, oh, if we fail, that is a part of the deal. So we're not worried about failure. And if nothing happened in 2-3 years' time, we say, oh, that's just experiment. It's just it's a justification for possible failures, I'm afraid. And actually the way we do it, it's not so innovative because we take it in a very old-fashioned way. We collect the information. Of course, we have some themes which need, of course, imagination and certain creativity. But the way we just to look at all the material and try to discern what is possible connection and etc. It is, I suppose, the most intuitive way of looking at the world. So yeah, so I mean, that's not an experiment in the really the scientific lab way. You know, you establish a causal relations, you give this condition and see what comes out. Not in that sense. I mean, the Chinese has experimentation has 2 terms. One is called a test experimentation, 试验. Another one is a practice experimentation, 实验. Socialism was projected and presented as experimentation, the second type of experimentation, practice experimentation, I mean, in all the early socialist writing. And what Benjamin went to Soviet and he wrote the essay, the entire country is a lab. Everything is experimental. And it's certainly they're not doing any testing, right? But they are just to try to, you know, in my view, is to justify their possible failure and have enough courage to face possible failures. I stop here. Thank you.